Okay, so you've reached that awesome C2 level in English, huh? That's a huge accomplishment. You can talk about pretty much anything in English, but now you're ready for the next step, right? That near native level where it just flows naturally. It's about smoothing out those little rough edges, really getting those subtle meanings that textbooks don't always cover. It's about sounding like a native speaker.
It is, it really is. At that point, you're moving past just understanding the words themselves. You're picking up on the unspoken parts, the cultural context that native speakers just get. It's a whole new level of fluency.
And that's what we're diving into today. A method that's not just effective, but also really fun. Using TV shows to boost your fluency.
Yeah, forget about those boring grammar exercises for a bit.
I agree completely. At this point, you've got a really solid base. And what's great about TV series is that they can help you develop that natural flow, the rhythm and intonation that native speakers use without even realizing it. You also start to really grasp idiom slang and those underlying cultural assumptions that shape how people communicate. It's not just about learning more words, it's about understanding how the language actually works.
You got it. It's like being immersed in real, unscripted conversations. You're not just reading words on a page, but hearing how they connect, how the tone of voice changes the meaning. And the best part, you can do it all from your couch. It's a big change from memorizing lists of words.
And what's really cool is the huge variety of TV shows out there. Whether you're into intense dramas, funny comedies, sci-fi, or historical shows, each genre gives you a unique linguistic experience, different ways of speaking, and specialized words.
All right, let's get into some specific shows, shall we? How about starting with one that some people see as a real challenge, The West Wing.
The West Wing is definitely tough, but it's super rewarding for C2 learners, especially if you're into politics and current events. It's set in the White House, so you get a behind-the-scenes look at American politics. And yeah, the language is sharp and fast-paced.
It's like a verbal tornado. Characters talking over each other, all those jargon and technical terms, and then the witty banter and wordplay. It's like you need a special dictionary just to follow along.
What's interesting about that feeling of being overwhelmed is what you learn from it. If you can train your ear to understand those rapid exchanges and the fancy vocabulary of the West Wing, you'll find it much easier to follow everyday conversations with native speakers. You know how the overlapping dialogue and fast back and forth not only make it exciting, but also show the stress and quick decisions of the White House? Notice how they cut each other off and build on each other's sentences? That's how people talk in high-pressure jobs.
When I first tried watching it, I had to pause and rewind so many times. It was like a workout for my listening skills. That's a good tip for our listeners, right? Don't be afraid to slow things down and listen again and again.
For sure. Repeated listening is key, and the benefits are huge. You'll learn tons of specific political vocabulary like filibuster veto caucus, words you need to understand news and political articles.
And it's not just about knowing what the words mean. It's about seeing how they're used to persuade, argue, and even use fancy rhetoric, like a masterclass in using language to get what you want.
And don't forget, even though it's about serious stuff, the show is full of sharp wit humor, sarcasm, irony, clever wordplay. It's not all just serious policy talk. Notice how a small change in tone or the way something is said can totally change the meaning.
You can really tell that Aaron Sorkin, the guy who created the show, loves language.
He's a genius when it comes to writing dialogue. If you're looking for a good episode to start with, try Season 2's Two Cathedrals. It's powerful emotionally and a great example of that unique language style.
So The West Wing, for those who like a linguistic challenge with some politics thrown in. Now let's switch gears to something with a completely different vibe. A show that's famous around the world. Friends.
Oh, Friends. A classic sitcom that some advanced learners might think is too easy for them. But actually, that's not true at all.
I know what you mean. People tend to think sitcoms are too simple for C2 level. But they have something really special, natural, everyday English that you don't always hear in more formal settings.
That's it. And for C2 learners, it's important to see how even these simple conversations are full of subtle social cues, implications, things people don't say directly, and those natural pauses and rephrasing that you don't often find in textbooks. Plus, Friends had a huge cultural impact. All the catchphrases, running jokes, they're a big part of pop culture. Understanding these references can really make you feel more connected to the English-speaking world.
And Friends is great at showing each character's personality through how they talk. Each of the 6 main characters has such a unique way of speaking.
And what's interesting is how those little quirks in their language really define their characters. Chandler's sarcasm and witty comments, Monica's precise and sometimes controlling speech, Phoebe's unusual and quirky words, and then there's Ross with his awkward and overly formal way of talking. Listen for specific things like Chandler using rhetorical questions a lot, or Monica using fancy words in normal situations.
Yeah, and hearing those patterns over and over helps you understand how language reflects and shapes personality.
Which brings us to a bigger point. Language isn't just about sharing information, it's also about expressing who you are and connecting with people. Friends shows this perfectly through the unique voices of its characters.
So for C2 learners watching Friends, what specific things in the language should they pay attention to?
The show is full of idioms and phrasal verbs. Those can be tricky, but they're so important for natural English conversation. Also pay attention to the rhythm of their conversations, how they interrupt each other, how they finish each other's sentences, and the subtle changes in tone that can say so much without words. Listen to how they use just their tone of voice to show sarcasm, surprise, or agreement.
And the humor. So much of it is based on wordplay, puns, misunderstandings.
Absolutely. Trying to understand the humor is a great way to improve your grasp of those subtle aspects of language. For a great example of that fast, witty dialogue, watch The One with the Embryos, the quiz show episode. It's classic, friends fast back and forth, and funny misunderstandings.
Friends, it might seem lighthearted, but it's a surprisingly good way to learn those everyday nuances of language.
Okay.
Let's change things up again and talk about a much darker show, Breaking Bad.
Breaking Bad. This show definitely pushes the limits with its language reflecting its intense and often disturbing themes. It's a crime drama about dark stuff, so the language can be raw and aggressive.
Not for the easily offended, that's for sure. Lots of strong language, violence, and talk about drugs. But for C2 learners who want a real challenge and are interested in how language can create tension and show complex characters who aren't always good or bad, it's fascinating.
What's really striking is the difference in how Walter White and Jesse Pinkman talk. You have Walter, the former chemistry teacher, with his smart and complex vocabulary, and then Jesse, his former student, who uses a lot more slang. Notice how Walter's background and education are clear from his word choice and sentences.
It really shows how language can be a sign of your social class and education.
And it's not fixed either. As Walter gets deeper into the criminal world, his language changes. He gets more ruthless, manipulative, even starts using Jesse's slang and swearing. This change in his speech mirrors his moral downfall. Pay attention to when Walter uses Jesse's phrases. It shows how he's changing and trying to fit into a world that was so different from his own.
It's like his language reflects his changing identity.
Exactly. And the setting, Albuquerque, New Mexico, adds another layer. You'll hear regional accents and expressions. And because it's close to the Mexican border, there's a lot of Spanish words and phrases. It gives you a taste of how language works in parts of the U.S. where people speak multiple languages.
Linguistically, it's a rich experience, even if the story's pretty dark. Are there any episodes of Breaking Bad that really show off its unique language?
Season 5's Ozymandias is incredibly powerful. It's super dramatic and intense emotionally, and the language reflects that raw feeling. The dialogue becomes very direct and to the point, highlighting the emotional breakdown of the characters.
Breaking Bad. A tough but rewarding journey into the darker side of American English. Okay, let's hop across the Atlantic to London and experience the sharp wit of Sherlock.
Sherlock. A true gem for English learners. The language is rich, witty, and delivered at lightning speed.
And so British. Benedict Cumberbatch as Sherlock is legendary, partly because of his incredibly clear speech, his impressive vocabulary with all those long, complex words, and that sharp wit often delivered in those rapid-fire, almost like he's thinking out loud monologues.
It's like we're right inside his brilliant mind, seeing how fast it works. And then there's Martin Freeman as Watson, who provides a nice contrast with his down-to-earth and relatable way of speaking. His reactions and simpler language often reflect what the audience is feeling, trying to keep up with Sherlock.
He keeps us grounded in a way. That back and forth between them is what makes the show so captivating.
Exactly. And it's not just the speed. The writing itself is super clever, full of puns, subtle wordplay, and references that make you want to watch it again and again. Plus, the show looks amazing and really captures the atmosphere of modern London. Notice how the writers use double meanings and how the characters play with language to outsmart each other.
And the British humor and cultural references are everywhere.
They are, which makes it a great way to learn about British culture while you improve your language. To get a taste of Sherlock's style, start with the very first episode, A Study in Pink.
Sherlock. A must-watch for anyone who wants to immerse themselves in smart, fast-paced British English with a modern feel. Okay, let's step back in time now to the world of 1960s advertising and Mad Men.
Mad Men. This show oozes style and sophistication. Set in the world of advertising executives in the 60s, It's a beautifully made period piece.
It's so authentic in how it portrays the era, the clothes, the music, and especially the language. The dialogue is polished and elegant, just like how people talked in those days.
What's really interesting is seeing how language was used in advertising back then, how they created slogans and campaigns. It's a glimpse into a world where persuasive language was everything. Pay attention to how carefully they choose their words and how important it was to craft the perfect message.
And the characters, they're so complex, flawed human with all their secrets and desires and the tension between them.
Absolutely. A lot of the drama in Mad Men comes from the relationships between the characters and the often subtle ways they use language to manipulate each other and get what they want. Pay attention to what's not said in their conversations that can be just as important as the words themselves.
It's a masterclass in reading between the lines, isn't it? Which episode would you recommend to really understand Mad Men?
The season 1 finale, The Wheel, is really powerful. It's both emotional and important for the themes of the show. It really captures that feeling of ambition, nostalgia, and the power of storytelling.
Mad Men. For those who appreciate nuanced writing, great acting, and a glimpse into a time gone by with its own unique language. Now let's jump to a show that's stylish in a completely different and often creepy way. Black Mirror.
Black Mirror. This show feels so relevant to the world we live in today. It's a sci-fi anthology that explores the dark side of technology and makes you think.
It really makes you question how technology is affecting our lives and society as a whole. And the language is often as creative and unsettling as the futuristic ideas it explores with lots of technical terms and made-up words.
It can be a challenge, but that's part of what makes it so interesting. The writers are so inventive with language, creating these often dystopian worlds. And each episode has a distinct look and feel. Pay attention to how new technologies and their impact on communication are reflected in the characters' language.
If you're curious about Black Mirror, which episode would you recommend as a starting point?
Nosedive from season 3 is a good one to start with. It's a scary satire about a world obsessed with social media ratings and being popular online, and the language reflects that world. Notice the specific words and phrases they use for social scores and online interaction.
Black Mirror for those who like to be challenged intellectually and linguistically, and who aren't afraid to think about the future of technology. Now let's move on to a show that's set in the past but still feels relevant today. The Crown.
The Crown. This historical drama about Queen Elizabeth II's reign is just incredible. The production quality is top-notch, the acting is fantastic, and the costumes and sets are so detailed.
And the language is so interesting. It gives you a glimpse into how the royal family talks. So formal, so careful with a focus on tradition and protocol. It's a big contrast to the other shows we've talked about.
What's really insightful is how The Crown shows the power dynamics of language. It's a perfect example of how the way you speak can convey authority and status. Notice how they use very precise phrasing and avoid contractions in formal situations.
And you can see how the Queen's language changes over the seasons, can't you? From a younger, maybe less confident speaker to the strong and assured monarch. And it's fascinating to see how other characters change how formally they speak, depending on who they're talking to.
You're right. For an episode that really shows the essence of the show and its exploration of language, duty, and sacrifice, I'd recommend Hyde Park Corner from season 1. It focuses on the Queen's reaction to her father's death. Pay attention to the language they use when they're grieving and the difference between how they speak in public and in private.
The Crown. For those who are into British history, the royal family, and the subtleties of formal English. Okay, let's wrap up our tour with something lighter and definitely funny. The Office.
The Office. This mockumentary comedy about a paper company in Scranton, Pennsylvania is hilarious. And the characters, while they seem ordinary, are well developed and so quirky.
It's a brilliant satire of office life, all the rivalries, the awkward moments, the absurdity of it all, and the language feels so real and unscripted.
What's interesting is the mix of everyday English and those specific words you hear in offices. Plus, they improvise a lot, which makes the dialogue feel natural and spontaneous. Listen to how the characters use informal language and humor to deal with uncomfortable or tense situations.
For a classic example of The Office's unique and often cringeworthy humor, which episode would you pick?
Dinner Party from season 4. You have to see this one. It perfectly captures that awkward and hilariously uncomfortable vibe. The dialogue is a masterclass in unspoken tension and passive-aggressive communication.
The Office. For those who love observational comedy and want to see how people use language in those awkward everyday situations. So there you have it, a bunch of different TV series that can be really helpful and enjoyable as you work on perfecting your C2 English skills. And this is just a starting point. Of course, there are tons of other great shows out there. But hopefully this gives you some ideas.
The key is to pick something you really enjoy. When you're having fun, learning the language happens naturally. Don't feel like you have to watch something just because you think it's good for your English.
Exactly. Find a show that hooks you, relax, and get lost in it. But also remember to be an active viewer. Pay attention to how the characters use language, the different ways they express themselves, and think about how you can use those techniques in your own speaking and writing.
And don't be afraid to use those playback buttons. Pause, rewind, look up words you don't know. The more you actively engage with the language, the better you'll learn it.
So there you go. Using TV shows. A fun, effective, and let's face it, a great excuse to watch more TV as you keep getting closer to sounding like a native English speaker. What are you waiting for? Get watching. Join us next time for another deep dive.
Happy watching!
Until next time.